We're going to have a good time in the Word of God. We always have a good time in the Word of God. I want to continue on something that we've been talking about over the past couple weeks on Sabbath. We've been in the season of Purim, talking about the significance of Purim, talking about the events of Purim. This last week we had a rather fun Purim. This is our first play from this church. If you guys weren't there, you missed out on a really fun time. But in the midst of the fun and the celebration of Purim, there's an element of seriousness. There's an element of significance to it that goes beyond just a surface glance. And we talked a little bit more about a couple Sabbaths ago. We were talking about the hidden things of Purim and how Esther, the name Esther itself, means hidden, and how the entire book, you never see God's name mentioned, for one, but He's very apparently at work. So there's a lot of lessons to take out of that. But there's even another connection that I want to start making between Purim and Passover. We're already in March. Isn't that amazing? I don't know where this year's already going. It's the third month of the year already. And the end of this month is Passover, which, as we know, is one of the most significant times. We haven't crossed into the month of Nisan quite yet, but that's coming up, and that's something that we should be taking seriously. We should be preparing for, because that's God's new year. He said this is to be for you the beginning of your years. So if He says that this is the beginning of the year, we should treat it with as much reflection, as much seriousness, as much planning and contemplation as we do January. December into January. There's a lot of people that they'll start making their New Year's resolutions. They'll start thinking about what did I do last year that I can change? What do I need to do differently this year to make this year different than last year? This is really a time when it's good for us to do that. And to not just reflect on, let's say, like the failures of the last year, but reflect on, where has God come through for us? Where has He been faithful? Where has His mighty hand of deliverance been shown, even if it was hidden, so to speak, in the midst of everything? And I think for each of us, we can testify that we see the faithfulness of God in the land of the living. We've seen His faithfulness over the past year. We've seen how He's been faithful to us as a congregation over the past year. We've seen how He's been faithful to us personally over the past year. And that should invoke our faith to be able to say, because He's been faithful before, I know He's going to come through again. So when you look at just the surface level, you think that Purim and Passover are two completely different holidays and two completely different celebrations. They're actually not all that different when you start looking into it. Starting right with this, Purim means lots. And we know that Haman cast lots for the day on which the Jews were going to be killed. And so people think, oh, it's just chance. It's just a game of chance. But even things that look like they're just chance, you see Yahweh's thumbprint on it. So the day which the edict was issued that the Jews should be annihilated was made on the 13th day of the month of Nisan, the day before Passover. As they're preparing, this means that every Jewish household in Persia is preparing, searching their house for the chametz, searching their house for the last bit of leavening, preparing for the beginning of Passover the next day. Suddenly they have this shocking news that's brought to them that 11 months later, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which would be the month of Adar, is when this edict has been set to be that the Jews will all be murdered. So, they're right on the cusp of celebrating the miraculous deliverance at the Red Sea, and all of a sudden now they're faced with this news that in just 12 months, you're all going to be wiped out, basically. But when you start looking at it, you see that it's almost like Yahweh's message is like, the one who delivered you from the Egyptian Pharaoh long ago is still going to continue to deliver you now. And there's an idea in Judaism that Pharaoh was not just someone that what existed in that story of the Exodus. There's been a Pharaoh in every generation that has tried to wipe out the Jewish people. We can see that throughout the ages, you know, whether it be Hitler's army trying to exterminate the Jews, whether it be the pogroms of Russia, whether it be, you know, there's a leader that rose up in every age, every era that tried to wipe out the Jewish people. And each one failed, by the way, because you can't touch the apple of God's eye and get away with it. You know, never ends good for them. So Purim's a fulfillment of the saying from the Passover Haggadah. Not just one Pharaoh rose against us to exterminate us, but in every generation did they rise up to exterminate us, and each time the Holy One, blessed be He, has rescued us from their hands. That's read every year in the Passover Haggadah. So they're declaring not only their past redemption, you can see that they're declaring their future redemption. They're declaring the one who comes for in the past, the one who came through every time someone is risen up against us. So through us. So we're going into transition to the awareness. You know, you're talking about revealing the things that are hidden. It's a time. Again, I never even knew that this edict was made on the 13th of Nisan. You know, when you look at a book in the Bible, especially you look at the story of Esther, it can seem like, okay, so, you know, there's this banquet happens. A few days later, there's another banquet that happens. And then Vashti says she's not going to it. And then he says, okay, do away with Vashti. A few days later, okay, now I'm going to have all all the women in Persia come together and all this, and they prepare, and then they have, now there's a new queen. And then a few weeks later or whatever, it seems like it's like a boom, boom, boom. This happens like in a short period of time. They say that the entire story of Esther happened over a 10-year period of time. The entire thing. She had already been queen for several years before this even happened. King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, whatever you want to call him, he went without a queen for several years. So it wasn't like Vashti's gone, okay, I'm just going to get a new queen. It was like Vashti's gone, he didn't have a queen for a few years. And then he finally goes on this search for a new queen. So it's interesting when you start seeing the timeline of things, and it's like it's not just as cut and dry as it appears. It's not just like, okay, this all happened within a short amount of time. There's time in this. So when you see that, okay, so on the 13th of Nisan is when Haman makes this decree, this demonic decree, is on the 13th of Nisan. Well, it wasn't to be enacted for another 12 months. Or 11 months, actually. But it was not to be enacted for another year. So when you start seeing this, parallel that to what was it that Esther said when she found out about it? Okay, the Jewish people are to fast. They fasted through Passover that year, which means that the day that she went in to see the king would have been Nisan 15. So just after Passover, she's in the middle of this time of unleavened bread, and she's going in to save her people once again. So it's amazing how you start looking at these things and seeing the parallels. But not only that, I started looking at these different parallels between Esther and Moses. There's a lot of parallels and similarities between Esther and Moses. Both of them occurred outside of the land. Both of these instances occurred outside the land of Israel. One was in Egypt and one was in Persia. Both of them were in places of royalty. Think of Moses. He was in an Egyptian palace. He was set up to be an heir to the throne almost, pretty much, adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter. And so he's in a royal position. Here's Esther. She's queen of Persia, basically. So they're both in these royal positions, you could say, for such a time as this. But as we're going to start finding out later, they had to do something with that position in order to be positioned for Yahweh to be able to use them. So that's just kind of like a background to this, because I found that quite interesting that this whole story happened around Passover. You know, it's again, and you start looking at it, and the book of Esther is so full of these different secrets, mysteries, and ironies that you don't even see if you're just looking at it. You know, looking at the entire book of Esther, the entire story of Esther seems like it was just happenstance. Okay, Queen Vashti just happens to pick this time to refuse to come to the king's royal feast. And then the king just happens to decide to find a new queen. Mordecai just happens to be at the right place at the right time to hear those guards discussing their plans. And it wasn't a birthday party that they were trying to discuss with them. But he just happened to be at that place to hear that plot against the king's life and take action to thwart that plan. The king just happened to have a sleepless night and asked for the book of the Chronicles, of all things. Like, I mean, if I have a sleepless night, I don't necessarily want a giant book of like all the deeds that have been done. You know, it's not really the bedtime story that I would think of. But he just happened to call for that, which just happened to open to the place where they talk about Mordecai saving his life. You know, Haman just happened to be coming outside, you know, outside the court. You know, all these things seem to be, it just happened to be. But you see the setup in it. You see that God was at work behind the scenes. When you look at the closest reference to God in the book of Esther is when Mordecai tells Esther that redemption for the Jews, if she doesn't rise up, Mordecai says to her that the redemption for the Jews will come from another place. He says another place, which in Hebrew is makom aher. Well, what do all of us who are Hebrew, know any Hebrew here, know what hamakom is, the place. So this is a reference to the place. In Judaism, they refer to God as the omnipresent, but it's connected to the place. So you can see that hidden behind what he's saying that if she doesn't act, God's going to bring redemption regardless, but she and her father's house will perish. So he's working out all these details behind the scenes. He's working out every single detail of this deliverance story. But when you start looking at this story, you start realizing that Esther had a secret identity. And that's what I want to focus on tonight, is the identity. Esther, I can't say it without laughing. She was a Jew, but she did not let on to her identity. Mordecai was in on that. He was the one who encouraged her to keep that a secret because it could be a risk. But when he knew that the moment was right, when he knew that there was no other way, that he saw prophetically that she was in that place for such a time as this, he said, listen, you've got to step up for your people. You've got to stop hiding. You've got to stop keeping your identity a secret. You've got to step out. So she did not reveal her true identity until the exact moment when it was necessary to defeat the plot of Haman. And it was like timing is everything in everything. So at the beginning of the book of Esther, we see this orphan Jewish girl. Her real name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, living in exile in the land of Persia. So she could seem like she's in a place where she really has no rights. She has no future. She's not even in the land. She's in exile. Doesn't have parents. She's being raised by her uncle. But Yahweh saw potential in her. He saw that she could be a courageous and godly queen. I'm sure Esther didn't even see that in herself. I'm sure Esther did not see herself as being queen material. I can be the queen of Persia. That probably was never a dream of hers growing up. But the question is whether or not, when we look at that, would we have the same courage, perseverance, and determination to take hold of a position that's put before us? Whether it's something that we seem like, okay, that's been my dream all my life, or I don't even know why I'm here. I don't know why you would want me in this place. I'm not comfortable being in there. But are we willing to take that step if that's what Yahweh's called us to do? When you look at it, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. This was Esther's identity. Mordecai is showing Esther her true identity in this, but she had to choose to identify with her own identity. She had to choose to take on that identity as her own. And she could have chosen to take on that identity, or she could have chosen to reject it. At that point, the ball's in her court, literally in her court. But she had to make that choice. Jumping over to Moses. Moses also had a hidden identity. Moses, raised in an Egyptian palace by Pharaoh's daughter, he's a Jew with a hidden identity. He had to keep his Judaism hidden at that point. I mean, the Pharaoh wanted to wipe out all the Hebrew babies. How did Pharaoh's daughter just happen to be at that place in the river to pick up this baby and say, I'm going to take him on as my son? I mean, again, happenstance, like really? But he had to choose this identity. He had to choose to set aside, and there's somewhere in the New Testament, it talks about how he set aside the glory of Egypt to identify with his people who were slaves. And I found this interesting when I started looking into, I was looking up the Hebrew word for identity. And interesting, the word identity is not used in the Bible. Like, there's not the word identity. You'll not find in the Bible that it says the identity, except for in the Amplified where it goes on into more detail about things. But the actual word identity is not in there. But in modern Hebrew, the word identity is zehut, which the root word of zehut is zeh. So zeh is this. So like if you want to say, what is this? Mazeh. What is this? Or zeh Bible. I don't know what that would be. But zeh is this. So literally this word zehut means thisness. So it's like pointing to this is who you are. This is who you are. But in the interesting concept that's around it in Judaism is they say that it's critical to align yourself with your zehut, because if you don't, there are those who will tell you how to align yourself. So if you don't identify, this is who I am, other people will try to tell you who you are. And who other people tell you you are is most likely not who you really are. This is why there's so much peer pressure in the world nowadays. This is why there's so much pressure to adapt to our culture, to be conformed. You know, we see that in Romans. Do not be conformed to this world. Well, being conformed means that there's something that's pressing you into a certain mold. There's something that's trying to press you. And there's a lot of pressure in this world. We can say that there's a lot of pressure in this world on our young people, but if we're honest, there's a lot of pressure on everyone to conform, to not stick out, not be different. Well, you know, we want to be liked. We want people to accept us. And there's this pressure to be accepted in the world. We have to adapt. We have to change who we are to meet that standard. There's a lot of pressure to do that. And unfortunately, too much of the church has conformed to that standard. Too much of the church has lowered, or actually they've denied their true identity. They're hiding their identity. So you might think that you'll be the one who is going to witness. I'm going to be a strong witness for Yeshua. I'm going to tell people the gospel. But if you're at work and nobody at work knows that you're a Christian, then you got to start examining. Are you being like Esther at the time when she was hiding her identity? Are you being Moses in the palace? Nobody knows you're a Jew. Nobody knows you're a Christian. It's time for you to come out and show your true identity. We need to know who we are, where we are from, and what defines us as a people. You know, if you don't have history, then you don't know where you're headed. If you don't know your history, you don't know where you've come from, you don't know what God has saved you from, you don't know where you're going. You don't have any. You have to know where you've come from to know where you're going to. Jacob, looking at the story of Jacob, you know, he goes on, he's going through his life, and he's called to be one of the patriarchs. But how many of you know his younger life was pretty messed up? He made some mistakes. We'll get into that a little more after. But he comes to this momentous point in his life where we see this odd encounter with an angel where he starts wrestling with him, and there's this whole encounter with this man, this angel, whatever it was, and he starts wrestling with him and asks for the blessing and all that. And what does this angel tell him before he leaves? Your name will be Israel. He renames him, and then Jacob moves on. So sometimes in order to move on to where you're called to move, you've got to take on a new identity. And sometimes that means a change of name. You know, look at Abraham. You know, Abram, I've called you to be a father of many nations, and your name will be Abraham. So Abraham starts calling his name that. You know, sometimes you have to pay attention to what you're calling yourself, what you're labeling yourself. I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here. But I found this article that was talking about Esau and Jacob. And you see the stark contrast between how Jacob lived his life and how Esau lived his life. But again, this is one of those interesting things that you don't see necessarily if you're just reading it in our English Bibles. You won't necessarily see the significance of what's being said. You won't necessarily see the background of the story. So I found this article. It's talking about in Genesis 25:27, when the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. So that's what our English translations say. You know, Esau became a skillful hunter, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. So it seems like this is a contrast between Esau and Jacob, and they're trying to make that evident. So Hebrew often communicates deep meaning through what is absent from the text. So a lot of times what we have is translators will try to fill in gaps in the Hebrew text to try to make things make sense. If they wrote it out as is, a lot of the Bible wouldn't actually make sense because you don't know where it's coming from, and why are there no verbs used? Why are there no adjectives? Why is this part of speech missing from this passage? So such is the case with this verse. In the English translation, the copula is added in the second part of this verse. So the verse reads, Jacob was a peaceful man. However, if we examine the Hebrew construction, we find that there's a verb in the first part of the verse. Esau became a skillful hunter. And what's the verb in that sentence? Became. Very good, class. But in the second part of the verse, there is no copula. The verb is absent. So there's no verb in the second part of the verse. Literally, the verse reads, Jacob tam. The word tam is from the root tamam, which means to be complete. I think we touched on that a few months back. We were talking about a whole person, a complete person. So the word tam, so it probably shouldn't be translated as peaceful. When you look at the word tam, complete, it doesn't necessarily mean peaceful. They're trying to make a comparison or an opposite of what Esau was by translating this word as peaceful. But it might be better translated as complete in the sense of healthy, sound, or upright. So Aviva Zornberg comments on a midrash on this verse. The midrash draws attention to the way in which Jacob, in particular, chooses to construct his identity. There's a subtle asymmetry in the verse, and Esau was a skillful hunter, and Jacob a simple man. The lack of a verb in the description of Jacob suggests a less than satisfactory identity. It means it hastily assumed for the purposes of differentiation. If Esau has chosen to be a hunter, a complex, disintegrated spirit, I thought that was an interesting way to describe Esau. He's a disintegrated spirit. A sufferer of angst, then Jacob must assume the opposite role, the passive, limbless scholar absorbed in the worlds of his father and grandfather. If Esau is a hairy man, then he must be a smooth, sincere man, capable of periodic at-one-ment, unmenaced by ambiguity. Notice that the Midrash treats Jacob's identification as a contrast to Esau. In spite of the word tam, the Midrash views Jacob's character as a hasty reaction to Esau's becoming. So they're treating it as if this is a hasty reaction. So because he's this way, because Esau is this way, Jacob's this way. Two interesting and very profound ideas arise from this odd arrangement of the verb and no verb. First, notice that Esau is not a hunter of a man of the field. Rather, he becomes a hunter. That's not how he is born. He became a hunter. His identity is gradually assumed over the course of some time. The field of Esau's darkness, however, is a field of silence. The tension of ambush, the release of bloodshed provides the illusion of a vital heartbeat in emptiness. Esau becomes a man of death. It's like, whoa, you start looking at that. It's not who he was born to be. He became that. He learns to not value the eternal, the connections that extend beyond the end of a heartbeat. Therefore, the birthright is worthless. You see the connection there? I never saw that connection with Esau. Esau became a hunter. He became someone who was driven for the kill almost. So because of that, he didn't value the eternal. You know, life is what you make it. It's a heartbeat. Just go get what you have right now. What matters to him is stealth, cunning, entrapment, and the kill. He becomes a man fixated by today. The promised covenant over the horizon is pointless. So because of how he's chosen to construct his identity, because of who he's chosen to become, it's actually set him up for failure in his entire life. And it's set him up to reject the very thing that is the most important thing. Contrast this with the elegance of the second part of the verse, Yaakov Tam. Jacob does not become what he is, he simply is. It doesn't say Jacob became Tom, it says Jacob Tom. He is what he is, complete, whole, entire, without blemish, until he tries becoming Esau. That's where he ends up taking the turn. God sees Jacob finished, ready to fulfill his role in the great drama God will unfold, but Jacob doesn't see what God sees. Jacob sees that he is not becoming what he most desires, to be loved by his father, a father who loves the becoming Esau. And so Jacob, the complete, disassembles himself to become what he is not, someone else. That's when you start seeing that he becomes a deceiver and a tricker and a swindler, and he starts doing all these things to try to make his way in the world. The summary of Jacob and Esau comes first. Their essential characters are radically different. They are supposed to be different. But the rest of the story is about one son who desperately tries to be the other son, with disastrous results for the entire family, until one day, years later, Jacob Tom realizes who he really is and returns to his brother all he has taken in order not to be who he is. So he finally comes to this moment of realizing, I don't want to be who Esau is. I want to be who I'm supposed to be. And that's when he really took his place in the covenant. You know, he had to go through this because he decided. Now, I don't believe this was Yahweh's intention for how his life was to play out. I don't believe his intention was for him to deceive his father, to do all this stuff, to try to trick people. And I don't believe that was Yahweh's intention for his life. But because he made that decision, it's a lot like the Israelites wandering in the desert. They were never meant to wander for 40 years in the desert. So Yahweh often has to work with what we give him to work with. You know, so he might say, this is my plan, plan A. This is my plan for your life. Every day of your life is written in my book. All you have to do is follow my plan for your life. But we in our pea-sized brains think we're so smart, and I don't want to take that step. I want to go this way. And we take our lives on a different course than what he ordained, what he destined us to walk on. And then does Yahweh say, oh my gosh, I didn't know they were going to make that mistake. What am I going to do now? You know, he knows everything. He knew what you were going to do. He knew this was his plan, and he knew you were going to choose to do this instead. So he has a plan B. Thank God he has a plan B, and C, and D, and E, and F, and however long it takes us to get it right. He is a God of the second and third and fourth chance. You know, I'm thankful for that. But when he has these plans, it's always to get you back to the original plan. You know, he's always trying to get you back. Okay, sometimes you have to make a big circle back around to get back to, okay, now you're back on track where I originally intended you to be. This is where you would have been if you hadn't made that detour. So, you know, we waste so much time in life through the detours we take. How many times have we wasted months, years even, of our life doing things that we were never intended to do, doing things that Yahweh never called us to do, and then one day we wake up and realize it? And we would save ourselves a lot of trouble if we just stayed on track in the first place. But what is absent in this verse is not simply the verb. What is absent is Jacob's recognition of his real identity. And in that absence resides the rest of the story. The missing verb raises one of life's great questions to us. Are you who you are, or are you trying to be someone else? Are you who God has called you to be, or are you trying to be like somebody else that you're seeing? That's some of the biggest things. You know, for all these young people who think, I'm my own person, I'm just going to be who I'm called to be, and they have the wild-colored hair and all that. No, they're not being who they are. They're trying to look like someone else they've seen. It's inborn in human beings to imitate someone. Yeah, it's part of our DNA. We are just imitators of someone. You're always imitating someone. You just need to make sure you're imitating the right people. And by the way, when you start looking at, like, say, some of these, I don't know, actors, actresses, Hollywood stars that people say, you know, I want to be like that person. They're so cool, you know, a singer. Well, let's look at their entire life. You know, you can see them on a stage and say, okay, they sing perfect, they dress so beautiful, they blah, blah, whatever you might idolize in them. But let's look at their life behind the scenes. When the camera's not on them, who are they? And that is the biggest reflection that will come out through every aspect of their life. And a lot of times you find out that the person behind the scenes is not a person that you'd want to imitate. And honestly, they wouldn't want anybody imitating them themselves. You know, they wouldn't want to imitate themselves. A lot of these people are the most miserable, they're the most insecure, unloved, the desperate people just crying out for, does somebody just love me for who I am? You know, and if you start down that road, it's a dead end. So we have this Hebrew word zehut, which means thisness. This is who you are. This is who you're supposed to be, identity. In the Bible, there's a word that closely parallels this word, and it's the Hebrew word Shem, which a lot of us know what Shem means. Shem means name, or so it's translated. But there's a much broader translation of it that most of the translators miss out on. In a lot of translations of the Bible, we often encounter this word name being used in odd ways. So for example, let me see if I can find one of these scriptures to show what I mean. Maybe I didn't put it out. So for example, you have this verse in Psalms that says, those who know your name will put their trust in you. Okay, so if you know somebody's name, let's say it's just your name. Like I know Peggy, so I'm going to put my trust in them. Well, what does that really mean? Just because I know what her name is, why would I put trust in her? So when you say name as being just somebody's title, like George, Mary, whatever your name is, it doesn't seem to do what they're trying to capture. It doesn't capture the essence of what they're trying to communicate. And again, this is the problem in translation. When you just take one word and say, okay, it means this throughout the Bible, and then you run into these conflicts. So if we actually grasp what this word Shem means, we'll come a lot farther in understanding things. So imagine that a stranger walks up to you and asks, what's your identity? You could answer them by saying, Mary Smith. But your identity, your Shem, is much bigger than that. You are not just your name. I am not just Jordan Long. That's not my identity. Your identity is more than a verbal label that someone bears, even though the word Shem means name in that sense too. But in our culture, it comes from our education. Your identity comes from your education, your job, how others perceive your status, your reputation, or your authority. So this word Shem, actually encompasses a whole aspect of things that basically is an identity or a reputation. To speak in the name of someone biblically is to speak by their authority. So whenever Yeshua would say, I'm coming in the name of my Father, or the disciples would go and say, in the name of Yeshua, I'm speaking by his authority. You know, you can't use somebody else's name unless you've been legally granted access to that name. So I think it's Brother Copeland that talks about that, how Gloria, you know, she's Gloria Copeland. She has every right to use the name Copeland because she's legally married to him. But if some stranger off the street said, I think I'm going to name myself Mary Copeland, and I'm going to use the Copeland name, well, she has no authority to that name because she's not in covenant with him, right? Your name is who you're in covenant with. It's your reputation. It's your character. You can't separate your identity from your character, as much as people might try. To us, the word name usually brings to mind a person's first name, but in much of the world, protecting the family's name in the sense of the identity or reputation of the family is far more critical than their own name. So there was this story that I had read of this woman who was in an Arabic country, and these Arab boys had started like mocking her and making, you know, comments to her, and she turned to them and asked them what their name was, and they kind of like went silent for a moment. And they started telling, she's like, no, what's your last name? And they're like, well, why are you asking? Because I'm going to go find your father and tell them what you guys were doing, which instantly made them start begging her not to do that, and they stopped doing what they were doing because they valued their family reputation. They realized that their actions were not just reflecting on them, but it was reflecting on their entire family name. If we started internalizing that as Christians, that our actions are reflecting on Yeshua, we call ourselves Christians. I think there's a lot of people who should not be going out in this world calling themselves Christians, because every action they're taking, everything they're saying, is actually bringing a reproach upon his name. It should not be. That should not be. But to have a great name is to be well known and influential. To have a bad name is to be an embarrassment to everyone who knows you. You know, when you see in Proverbs, a good name is to be chosen more than riches. You know, it has to do with your central identity, your who you are, who you really are. When the scriptures talk about the word Shem, it doesn't even make sense translated as name. It's better understood as fame, renown, reputation, authority, or honor. So when you start, I encourage you, when you start reading your Bible, I mean, obviously it says his name is God. You know that's what it means. But when it starts talking, like say for instance that scripture, those who know your name will put their trust in you. Those who know your reputation will put their trust in you. For you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Makes a lot more sense than just saying those who know your name. We can have such a religious idea of what things mean that we're not grasping the whole concept of what he's trying to communicate in there. And what was David trying to say in that verse? If you know his reputation, you know you can put your trust in him because he's never forsaken those who seek him. You know, so when you start reading through the word, and wherever you see this word name, especially if it's in an odd place that it doesn't make sense, try to insert one of these things: authority, honor, reputation, renown, fame, and see how it changes the verse. And it might open up a whole different level of understanding to some of these verses that will. I was going to say blow your socks off, but I never use that. I never use that expression. When the scriptures talk about God giving a person a new name, it denotes that they are being given a new status in society. So Abram, a withered up wanderer, becomes Abraham, a father of nations. Sarai, a barren old woman, becomes Sarah, mother of princes. So when they change their name, they change their identity. How many times did Dad talk about how important it is when you're naming your child? What are you calling them? I mean, you see some of the names in the Bible. What was there's one in the Bible that I remember reading and saying, why would anybody ever name their child that? Like, you are a grief to me or something? It's like, oh, fool. Yeah, Nabal, fool. He is a fool. Why would you name your child a fool? Like, really? You got to think about it. And you know, I mean, in all seriousness, some of us maybe look at our own names and see what they mean. We might want to rename ourselves if we find that the name doesn't have a good meaning. But God changed their identity and gave them a new role in society, and it came with a change in name. So your name is your identity. The biblical name foreshadows the life events of each personality. So when you start seeing, like with Abraham, father of many nations, they called him that before he became a father of many nations. So it's like a prophetic word spoken into your life. Israel means leader of princes, or prince of God. So when you start looking at when they change, especially when they change their name, it's like a prophetic speaking into their future. Revelations 2:17 says, "To him who overcomes, I will give to eat of the manna that is hidden, and I will give him a white stone with a new name engraved on the stone, which no one knows or understands except he who receives it." It's your true identity. That's why no one else understands it, because it's your identity. He's writing your identity on that stone. The name, we look at Esther. You know, she's called Esther, but her original name was Hadassah. The name Hadassah, we know it means myrtle, but it represents righteousness. So when you look at it, the name Esther means hidden or concealed. The name Hadassah means righteousness. She was concealing her righteousness, really, in a sense, but she came out. She became a very righteous woman, and she's considered one of the matriarchs, so to speak, in the faith. Revelation 3:14, similar to the last verse that I read, "He who overcomes and is victorious, I will make him a pillar in the sanctuary of my God. He shall never be put out of it or go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which descends from my God out of heaven, and my own new name." Remember we talked about, it talks in Revelation about how when he shows up on his white horse, there will be a new name which is written on his robe. You know, it's a change of identity and a prophetic declaration for the future. So when you start looking at your identity and who you really are, it really requires an honesty with yourself. There's so many people in this world that are so confused about their identity. You know, that's why we have this whole gender identity crisis and people trying to, you know, some things, I'm just going to say this, some things you don't have to, it's not yours to determine what you're going to be. It's yours to discover what you already are. And some things are very apparent what you are, like what you're born as. Your gender is the first thing. So it's not, you know, if I was out on a quest to find out who I'm supposed to be in Yahweh, and I decided that I'm supposed to be a man of God that's going to be leading people, I'm off track, because I'm obviously not a man, right? So that should be just the basic level. There's some things that are just obvious. If you feel that your identity is to be, you know, like God wants you, well, obviously we're talking about your identity as being who God wants you to be. And you say, you know, my identity is a bank robber. You know, no, you're way off on that too. But in all seriousness, how many people identify themselves with what they've done in their life? You know, I'm a drunk. I'm an addict. I'm this. I'm that. And what they're identifying with is something that they've done, not who they are. We've got to be careful with who we identify, or even people who identify themselves with a particular disease they might have. I'm a diabetic. I'm a this. And they call themselves that. What are you naming yourself? What are you identifying with? I don't care what you might be fighting. Even if you're fighting against your flesh in this one area of your life, don't call yourself that. If you're fighting against a disease in a particular area of your life, don't call yourself that. Yahweh says, I am the Lord who heals you. I call you healed. So we got to call ourselves what He has called us. And we find that in the Word. Just start, Mom says this all the time, start looking through the Word to discover who He's called you. Just look at all the, Ephesians is a great place to start, because it talks about in Him, you are called this. In Him, all these in Him scriptures will help you to discover what your true identity is. Even if it's been hidden for years and years and years. Now's the time, like we said, for the Esthers to come forth. And that requires, and now is the time for the Daniels to come forth for you men. We're not leaving you out. But it's a time for these identities to come forth. But you look at just about every person in the Bible, and you see that to some extent or another, they all had an identity crisis. Look at Gideon, okay? He's hiding in a wine press, trying to keep his meager harvest from the enemy, from the Midianites coming and getting them. He's hiding there, and the angel comes, and he goes through his whole thing. I'm the least in my clan, and my clan's the least in the tribe, and the tribe's the least in all of Israel. But Yahweh doesn't even say anything about that. He says, Lord is with you, mighty warrior. That's who He's called him, mighty warrior. And Gideon had to choose to identify with that. Again, it's always a choice. Yahweh presented, this is who I'm calling you. But now the choice is up to you. Gideon could have kept with his own idea of, this is who I've identified myself as all my life, and this is who I'll be. Till the day I die, I'm going to be the least in my clan, the least in the tribe. He could have gone with that, and he never would have delivered Israel. But he chose to take on a new identity. And we see it very clearly in that passage where it says, and the Lord took possession of Gideon and clothed him with Himself. So it's like when you choose to take on a new identity, it's like, what does it say in Romans? You are a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. When you look at David, little shepherd boy in the field, basically a hidden identity, mocked by his brothers. He's little David, he can't even come up to the battle and blah, blah, blah. But what does it say? Yahweh doesn't look as man sees, He looks at the heart. It's your true identity that He's looking at. In all these cases, He saw something inside of their heart that He knew that He could call on in a moment when He really needed someone to stand up, and they would act on it because of their faith in His words. Not because of their faith in themselves, but because they recognized that He was calling something out of them, that He was calling on their true identity. So David, here he is, and Samuel goes through all of his brothers, and he's like, well, this one might be destined to be the next king, and nope, that's not that one. And Samuel comes to David, and it's like, this is the one. This is the one I've chosen, a man after my own heart. That's who David was identified as. That's what we know David's identity to be, a man after God's own heart. Even though he sinned with Bathsheba, killed Uriah, he's not known as a murderer. He's not known as an adulterer. He's known as a man after God's own heart because that's who his true identity was. Didn't mean he didn't make some very bad mistakes, but he knew how to repent. He knew how to turn back to who he really was, to come back to his center, to come back to this is who Yahweh's called me to be, and I got to stay in my position. You look at Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the three men in the fiery furnace. They held on to their identity in the midst of much pressure to conform. You don't know how much pressure was on these young men. They're young men. These were young men. And that's another thing that we don't tend to really grasp the age of these. David, they believe he was 17 when he killed Goliath. These are very young people that stood up and answered the call of Yahweh. But the amount of pressure that was on these young men to conform, even just to eat the king's food, but yet they chose to hold on to their identity as the people of God. And I'm not going to defile myself, because Yahweh has said this. This is who my identity is. And because of that, Yahweh came through for them. You see that in every situation. Look at Paul. He was a persecutor of the church. He was one of the most zealous people preaching against the church. But when he came face to face with his true identity, who Yahweh said, I'm calling you to be the preacher of righteousness to the Gentiles and bring this truth to the Gentile world, He made a complete turnaround and ended up being the most passionate preacher of all, and penned much of the New Testament because he took on his true identity. You know, it's never too late for somebody to turn around. It's never too late. You might looking at well, Samson's life was up and down. He had moments of clarity where he'd see his true identity, and then he'd get sidetracked by something else. But every person who did something great for the kingdom of God, whether it was in the Old Testament or New Testament, they had to take on a new identity. You see even in Paul's letters to Timothy, you know, when he says, you know, God has not given you a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and sound mind. And then later on he says, you know, the Lord has seen your tears and all that. So Timothy was under a lot of pressure as a young pastor of the church there. But he had to take on an identity that God has not given you a spirit of fear. That might be who you thought you were before. But He has given you a spirit of power and love and a sound mind. That's who you really are. So a lot of times our feelings, how we've lived our life up to this point, we can be so tempted to go with that and forget who our true identity is. You can change at any moment. You can decide to take on and live according to your new identity at any moment. But if you continue to say, you know, I've always been this way, so I'll always be this way, then you'll always be that way. But it has nothing to do with God keeping you there or anybody else keeping you there. Choice is yours at any moment. At any moment, you can choose to take on that identity of who you really are. You can choose to be a person of love. Whether you think that you've always been a bitter person or that you've always been known as somebody who has been angry, you can take on a new identity of who you've been called to be. Especially as a child of God, you've now been empowered with something that you couldn't have done in your own self. You've been given the strength of His Spirit in you, backing you up. He's working in you to carry out your salvation, which means that you are to take on to that new identity. You're now empowered to be who you're called to be. You're now empowered to be love in this world. You're now empowered to walk by the Spirit and not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. You're now empowered to do every command that's in this word. That's why it said that if you walk by the Spirit, you fulfill the law. Doesn't mean the law is done away with or that you don't have to keep the commandments. No, but it's giving you the empowerment to do it, and it's giving you the desire, the inner desire, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. So when you start looking at, you know, in 1 Peter 3, I like this verse so much. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 through 4, it says, "Let not yours be merely the external adorning with the elaborate interweaving and knotting of the hair, nor the wearing of jewelry or changes of clothes." Does it mean that those are bad things? No. It doesn't say don't do those things. It's let it not be merely the external adorning. But let it be the inward adorning and beauty of the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible and unfading charm of a gentle and peaceful spirit, which is not anxious or wrought up, but is very precious in the sight of God. There's a blueprint, so to speak, of who your identity of your heart is. This is who you're supposed to be. The Word of God says that our very life is hidden with the Messiah in God. We talk about these hidden identities. In Messiah, our true identities are sons and daughters of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, members of a royal priesthood. Just like Esther was willing to lay aside her own plans and her own dreams to fulfill her destiny, to fulfill our destinies, we must lay our hopes and ambitions on the altar and say, not my will, but yours be done. We need to have a change of will in a lot of times to bring our will into alignment with His so that we're going on the same direction, we're on the same page. We're not trying to pull two different ways. You know, I want to go this way, but you want me to go this way. Let's get ourselves into alignment with Him because His plan is the best plan. Yes. Ephesians 5:8 says, "For once you were full of darkness, but now you have light in the Lord. So live as people of light." Ephesians 2:12 says, remember that at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, so I like that, but now. That was your identity back there, but now you've taken on a new identity. You see this? You see this pattern throughout the Word. This transformation, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You're supposed to have a change. You're supposed to have a new identity. Like Esther had a secret identity, the church may also have a hidden identity, not separate from the Jewish people, but fellow citizens and an integral part of the commonwealth of Israel. I think this is where the church got so far off, when we tried to separate ourselves from our Jewish roots. That's really where so much of these seeds of dissension so much were sown, where we were starting to get away and withdraw from our true roots, our true identity. We have no identity apart from who the Word was. He was Jewish. This is a Jewish book. We have no identity apart from this. So when one of the biggest awakenings, I believe, in the end times is the church coming back to the recognition of their roots, of who we really are. Let's recognize who we really are, and come to the point where we can say who we really are. Now we conduct our lives and our behavior based on our new identity. If we have a new identity, then we're supposed to live according to that identity. That's our reputation. That's our character. That's who we are. As believers, we're free of whatever old labels we might have had based on our old behavior. So whatever people might have tried to label you in the past, you can rejoice because that's not who you are anymore. You're not the old person. No matter what people's labels might try to call you, don't ever call yourself that. Don't ever label yourself. Don't ever identify yourself with the old. The old has passed away. Everything has become new. And the only way that can be brought into the present is if you bring it into the present by your actions. Your actions, your attitudes, the way you're acting, that can bring the past into the present. But as long as we're making sure that we're walking step by step in the Spirit, living out our new identity, that's when we're going to find who we really are in this world. So start looking at all the scriptures that say we are, we do. I think we had talked about this a while ago, especially in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 5, and 10. Talks about we walk by faith, not by sight. We look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are unseen. It's our identity. We call ourselves of the household of faith. We are of the household of faith. So in this household, in this family name, this is who we are. This is our identity. This is our character. This is how we live. This is how we act. So start looking at those scriptures in the Bible that talk about that. We walk by faith, not by sight. We look at not at the things which are seen. Take on your true identity and don't hide it anymore. And the only way you're going to find your true identity is in the Word. So I want you to write down these scriptures. You guys can look them up later on your own time. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 through 13, and verse 19 through 22. Ephesians 4, verse 1 through 2, and verse 17, and verse 22 through 24. And Ephesians 5, verse 10 through 11. Colossians chapter 3, 1 Peter 2, verse 9, and 1 John chapter 3. These are all excellent scriptures, excellent passages that talk about who we are, who we're called to be, who we're not anymore, but our new identity. So we need to start really, again, we're coming into the season of Passover. We're going to be talking a lot about that over the next few weeks. But let's take on the identity of the people of God that we're supposed to be. Let's take on our true identity and not keep ourselves labeled as the past, Because it's, like I said, it's time for the Esthers, it's time for the Mordecais, it's time for the Daniels, it's time for the people of God to rise up into these positions of greatness that we're called to be. But it's going to require us taking on our new identity, our true identity. Amen? Well, we trust that you've gotten something out of this message. We look forward to seeing you again on Sabbath as we discuss the Word of God. You have a blessed week.